you want something that is going to help your brain self-protect, and to also potentially does something that enhances or regenerates neurons, and that's what this is. And so when we're looking at uses, a lot of this is a neuroprotective use or cognition. Those are the two big things. We don't have any alternative options that are improving neurofunction right now, and they looked at again for motor neuron disorders. And so that's an ALS type of scenario where you actually have a motor neuron and significant movement disorder and improvement of that with motor testing.
That's
and
huge.
Cognitive improvement with it.
And we're talking about a peptide.
So if you can look at something that doesn't have side effects, is more natural, ease of use, then there's at least good potential alternatives. So welcome to the RMT podcasting channel with me, your host, Dr. Debra Durst. I am a traditionally trained physician with a practice now that specializes in regenerative medicine. And I have my co-host with me today.
Hey guys, Farideh Golombieski. I'm a board certified family nurse practitioner, and I work alongside Dr. Durst at Revitalize MD.
So what we are now able to do is actually comprehensively provide patients with non-traditional options that might not involve meds or surgery. And so what we're going to talk about today is a peptide, and it is called SEMAX. So peptides are an exciting and progressive area of medicine because they are amino acids, that's what a peptide is, that are going to basically be synthetic and made, but they are naturally occurring peptide sequences or a analog of that in the body that simulates a hormone or neurotransmitter in the body, gets the body back what it needs. And the first peptide was insulin. So we know that goes way back and peptides work. But we're going to talk about SEMAX today, what it is, what it's used for, some studies related to it, and then at the very end, we'll talk about how we put it into practice with our patients.
And how to utilize it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
So this one's exciting because it works on multiple different aspects. And there are some studies, we like to incorporate studies when we can. Unfortunately, because with peptides, they're not large studies, as Dr. Durst has pointed out on probably multiple of these podcasts
selank probably being the most recent one.
Absolutely. That a lot of research for human studies take a lot of money, take a lot of time, and they are backed by large pharmaceutical companies hoping to get a return investment on that research. So when we are looking at things that are peptides or like peptides that are naturally occurring in the body, that those are not something that these pharmaceutical companies can turn around and market and sell.
Yeah, it really comes down to being able to patent something. And so if it's naturally occurring, you have to change it in some way to be able to patent that and protect your investment. And if you're going to invest all that money in a study to bring it to market, you want to be able to protect that investment. It just makes sense. And so if it can't be patented, then you may not see large studies with it. And that frequently is the case with peptides. So, but there are studies. Yeah.
There are studies.
There are studies.
And they are great studies.
Yes. And so that's where we come in. Like, really, you want to see efficacy. You want to see that it works with something, that maybe there aren't good alternatives for that in traditional medicine that are being used, and that it's safe.
And safe.
Yeah.
Right? We want to see minimal negative side effects with use.
Yeah, so SEMAX, what is it? So we already talked about the fact that it's a peptide. A peptide is an amino acid sequence, and again, simulates a hormone or neurotransmitter in the body. And it is a synthetic analog of ACTH, or adrenocorticotropin hormone, which, again, it's an analog of that, but it doesn't have any hormonal effects at all.
That's it. It bypasses the endocrine system.
Yeah.
So that's amazing.
Yeah, so it's the part of the ACTH, or adrenocorticotropin hormone, that, and again, we'll refer to it as ACTH if we happen to say it again, but it doesn't have the activity of the hormone as that component that makes up SEMAX. And then they altered it on one end,
so that you get the central nervous system stability and effects where it can cross blood-brain blood-brain barrier.
Yeah, and this one is typically used as a nasal spray. It is for us as a nasal spray. So that is a direct, immediate passage to the brain. If you think about the nose or the nasal passages are close to the brain. And if you're, again, using a nasal spray, it gets right in there if it has the capability of crossing the blood-brain barrier, which SEMAX does.
Absolutely. And for those of you that don't know, ACTH plays a huge role in cortisol production in the body. So that's important to note as we go into kind of the side effects and what we use this for.
Correct.
So again, we are able to use this to cross the blood-brain barrier and affect the central nervous system. It does interact with nootropic factors, right? So that means that it can help support the growth, survival, and maintenance of neurons.
Yeah, so if you look at nootropic is like going to help with cognition and memory, but most of those effects can be also related to an increase in what's called BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotropic factor, and that is maintenance of neurons in the brain.
Yeah,
and
it is key for brain cell survival.
Yes, and protection, and it can also be for, again, neuron growth factors.
Yeah.
And so
neuroplasticity, all the things.
Yeah, so this is what you want. You want something that is actually, so in simplicity, without talking all the science, you want something that is going to help your brain protect, self-protect, and to also potentially does something that enhances or regenerates neurons. And that's what this is. And so when we're looking at uses, a lot of this is a neuroprotective use or cognition. Those are the two big things. So
neuromodulators that can help affect mood, stress, cognition, and then reward-related behavior. Right?
Yes.
Those are all things that can be positively affected.
Yeah.
So for SEMAX particularly, there's really three main components that it looks at, which is that cognitive performance, which you kind of hit on already, the neuroprotection, and then there's also some gastroprotection.
Yeah, and even a little bit of mood. But again, we talked about selank, which, we'll have the link at the end. And that's the one we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast. That's more an anti-anxiety use. They do have similar properties. There's some differences that are key as well. But the use of selank is mainly an anti-anxiety, but it has, again, that cognition and memory improvement, where this one
Is more the neuroprotective
more
cognition.
Yes, and less of the mood, although it does do that as well. So there were some studies. So again, we'll always talk about studies. This one was first researched in the 1980s in Russia by the Academy of Sciences or Academy of Medical Sciences, and researching it for what it could potentially affect and what it could be used with. It was actually brought to market in
2011. So the Russian Federation government
Yes.
approved it in 2011, and then they put it on their list of vital and essential drugs
Yes.
in 2012.
Yeah. So this has been used in Russia and essentially over there used for stroke, TIA, more neuroprotective, and even for eye issues like glaucoma and increased intraocular pressure and effects of that.
Cognitive disorders such as dementia.
Yes, yeah.
So this was developed back in the 80s in Russia. So they've been looking at SEMAX as an option for these type of diagnoses since the 80s. Think about that. Think about how long this has been available in other countries.
Yes, yeah.
It kind of blows my mind when you think about when we kind of get a little bit more into the science and the studies of we've gone this long, and this is a newer peptide for us, or at least for me, and it was brought to our attention by a patient.
Yeah.
Looking for an option to a brain injury.
Neuroprotection.
Exactly.
And so again, there's lots of things that it can do with neuroprotection, anti-inflammatory. It protects against the hypoxic effects, which are low oxygen in the brain. And so, and it actually even potentially could help with the negative effects of a more chronic or moderate to chronic alcohol use as well. And so if you look at that, there's very little that can actually enhance some brain improvement when you
Yes.
have neurons that have been affected by alcohol use, either chronic or moderate or more in consumption. So that's another issue, that there's lots of different ways it does that, and that BDNF is one of those. So, but the studies basically with cognition being one of them, which is the neurotropic effects, so it affects and improves cognition and memory. Not huge studies, but again, no adverse effects with these. And so that's one key thing. But it was a small study with 8 patients for one of them. And it was like a shift worker. It wasn't long.
It wasn't very long,
It was
no.
an 8-hour shift. So it's not like
Yep.
they were pushing 12 or 14-hour shifts. But even then, significant improvement. And
Absolutely. They did one that was posted for cognition performance in 1996. It was in the Neuroscience Research Communication. So, again, this is another Russian journal. And they were looking at the effects. So, the effects were lasting 24 hours from use. So, that was kind of one of the things that what you did that day had a 24-hour time frame on it. But they were looking at memory testing, and they showed that in the patients that used the intranasal spray had a 71% accuracy rate on memory tests compared to the controlled group that only had a 41% accuracy. So even, again, these are smaller groups, but even one use, they were showing that big of a difference, just memory, so on cognition.
And it did actually have one with imaging, with an MRI imaging, and positive effects that they could see on MRI, where it was stimulating, and potentially used even for ADHD, attention, hyperactivity deficit disorder, which is very commonly diagnosed here and for children, and stimulants are used right now. So
Yeah.
again, you're talking about FDA approval of drugs used for something that have side effects, and they have addictive, components, and they also have withdrawal. So
And abuse potential.
yeah, so this one was actually helpful. An MRI, enhancement in one of the studies for 24 patients, and so, those are, at least you can see with imaging, and then you can see improvement with testing. So there's doing some objective measurements in Russia to look at that, and so, but
And
then,
that was no negative side effects on that study.
yes,
And
no.
there was benefit memory, cognition, and brain development,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and stimulants are typically
Yeah.
used there. So if we're just looking at typical things used for these conditions like cognition, I mean, Adderall is a common drug used for that. With people who have brain fog and they want some, some attention, focus, then it's Adderall is a common use. And so if you can look at something that doesn't have side effects, is more natural, ease of use, and then there's at least good potential alternatives.
And unfortunately, Adderall particularly, that's a medication that's abused. Often.
And it's even a controlled too.
Yeah.
So that's a big deal. So again, controlled too, when you're talking about substances that are controlled by the DEA, controlled one is not legal for use in anything like marijuana, again, LSD.
Illicit drugs.
Yeah, illicit drugs. LSD, all that.
Heroin,
and then
cocaine, those illicit
yeah.
drugs.
So the next class is a class 2, which is what Adderall is considered. When you're looking at benzos, which we've talked about for anxiety and for selank, then you're talking about a class 4. So that's a big deal when you're using Adderall.
It's in the same family as opioids.
Yes, yeah.
So just to put it into perspective.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. Because again, there is that dependence that's there, and sometimes then the illegal, kind of pathway happens as well. So, neuroprotection. Did you find other studies with cognition?
So that was the one outside of the two that we'd kind of talked about prior. Was that one with looking at testing and short-term memory and long-term memory, where they were seeing those accuracy changes. So when we're looking at these peptides, because they are not FDA approved in our country, and that they are something that is naturally occurring in the body, even though synthetically made in a lab, there are not a lot of large studies out there to pull from.
Yes. Yeah. And you will hear us say that over and over again with peptides, only because, again, sometimes, and there's what we're going to get to next is actually one of those things where sometimes the three things that you really look for with these, because you're not going to find necessarily large studies. So the three things are, does it work? Are there any studies in humans that show any efficacy? Because you may not get large studies. Are there other effective alternatives for treatment? And do those have side effects? And are there safety concerns with it? Because what we're going to get to next, which is actually what it's being used for in Russia, is
Which
for
is the primary
neuroprotection.
focus of the medication.
Yeah, neuroprotection. And so when we get to this, we don't have a lot of medications that we can use in these conditions that are neuroprotective, but this potentially is something that can be used. And so stroke is one of those. Again, stroke, TIA, brain injury, and even optic issues or eye issues if they happen and have negative effects. So one of the things that happens in a brain trauma or in a stroke is you have decreased oxygen and blood flow, but then you're going to have inflammatory changes. So if it helps repair hypoxic damage, free radicals that form, or even inflammation that forms after it, we don't have a lot of things that actually improve anything in the brain post infarct.
Yeah.
And so
in this study in particular, it was a 2018 study with 110 stroke patients. So that's that's a pretty big number when you think about it. They did intranasal dosing, and they did 2 10-day courses. So think about that. 2 10-day treatments. So 20 days of treatment, and what they saw was increased plasma, the BDFN, and levels, and then improved motor performance, enhanced functional independence, and they did that off the Barthel index scores, which is the index used
That's a hard
for, I had to look at it because I wanted to make sure I pronounced it correctly. But that is the index used to assess functional improvement in stroke patients. So that is the official index used, the gold standard. And they saw across all those patients improvement in that motor function and then functional independence. That is huge.
It's huge. Like,
That's
again,
huge.
we don't have any alternative options that are improving neurofunction right now. And they looked at, again, for motor neuron disorders. And so that's an ALS type of, scenario where you actually have a motor neuron and significant movement disorder and improvement of that with motor testing.
That's
and
huge.
Cognitive improvement with it. Yeah.
And we're talking about a peptide that we are not seeing negative side effects, that we are not seeing negative effects from long use of this medication. So we know that they've been studying it since the 80s. They've been using it in practice since 2011 in Russia, a vital medicine in 2012 in Russia. And then what we're not seeing is damages from it, right? We're just seeing the benefits.
I was waiting for you to say something else because
I know
what I'm going to say.
I know. Go for it. I love
what
it.
we're not seeing is use here in the U.S.
And then we're not seeing use here.
Yeah, so we don't have adverse effects. We don't have good alternatives. And it has been used in other countries. It's a peptide. It's intranasal. It's ease of use for especially that type of patient. And so we're not using it here. So
And there's nothing currently that I could find clinically in study for us to even look at the use of this for traumatic brain injury or stroke.
Stroke, TIA, traumatic brain injury, motor
cognitive
neuron
diseases, motor neuron, exactly, optic
Parkinson,
nerve. I mean, there's so
Alzheimer's,
much.
Yeah, there's all
dementia.
Kinds of,
It's crazy.
Because even the dopaminergic effects, which is something that you see in Parkinson's, is also something that can be affected potentially with this. And I didn't see a huge part but neuroprotection is huge in Russia. That's what they're using it in optics. So if you have a glaucoma, something that is affecting your intraocular pressure with maybe potentially some damage to the eye, this is another thing that they're using it for in Russia for protection. So
and with success. So with success. So not just using with success.
Yes. So again, I would love to see. So we always talk. I hear a lot of. More studies are needed. We'd love to have more studies. Well, I would love to see more studies. I think that's great because this is something that is potential for use, and we don't have other options. So yeah.
But
Let's do it.
even gastroprotection. So I found a study on the gastroprotection. So it was a 2002 study looking at potential gastroprotectiveness and anti-ulcer effects. And in that study, it showed a healing rate in ulcers of 90% compared to the placebo group of 30%. 90% improvement in ulcers.
And this is one that the selank didn't show the gastric. They're very similar and there's differences, and this one did not show.
Yeah, and this is
Yeah.
SEMAX.
Yeah. We do have another option too that improves gastric issues, and it's a peptide and BPC. So if you haven't seen that podcast, then I would highly recommend that you look at that, because that's one of those body protective complex 157 that works for GI stuff too. But that's
But it's
awesome.
also known for inflammation.
Yeah, I didn't know that it
Yeah.
was used for gastric.
Gastric.
Yeah,
It's huge.
a
There was
big
some
one.
stuff on mood regulation, but the data was a little bit more scarce on my end of what I found, because I found more on selank.
Well, it was more on rats with the
Yeah.
SEMAX for sure for mood. So less on people, more on rats. So there wasn't strong evidence to support that, but it does, potentially have positive
Yes.
effects. So again, cognition, brain protection, potentially ADHD, and all those neuroprotective conditions that we would need neuroprotection with, but less with mood. So I think that again we'll do a podcast into the future of the selank SEMAX and kind of comparing and showing similarities and differences.
Because they do overlap quite a bit, and they can be stacked together depending on what you've got going on.
The important thing is there hasn't been adverse effects. They both are nasal. They can be alternated and used together. And so those are things to think about. Again, dosing depends on your physician, whether you even have a indication for it. So you need to be evaluated by a physician or provider, and that needs to be dosed. They are prescriptions, and so getting those illegally online is not something we promote. But we have said that in other podcasts. We've
In
said that
every
in comments.
podcast.
Yeah. So
Every peptide podcast.
yes. So, but again, let us know if you've had any experience with SEMAX, because we would love to hear your experience. And definitely let us know your comments. And if you want to hear anything else, because we are willing to deep dive into anything wellness or sexual wellness.